Ja, guten Morgen, sehr verehrte Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen im Thalia Theater. Ich begrüße Sie heute zu einem besonderen Vormittag, mitten in der Nacht. Es war, glaube ich, auch zu lesen, von Donnerstag auf Freitag erreichte uns die Nachricht, dass Blasio, der Bürgermeister von New York, der Einladung nach Hamburg und damit auch ins Thalia Theater folgen würde. Ich bin und wir sind sehr glücklich, dass dieser Besuch auf die allerdings buchstäblich allerletzte Minute doch noch stattfindet. Sie wissen, Blasio ist die Stimme eines anderen, Amerikas. Er gehört der demokratischen Partei an und vertritt offen das, worum wir auch ringen, nämlich die multikulturelle Identität der Weltstadt New York und die Werte, die Europa mit der amerikanischen Freiheitsstatue verbindet. Hamburg ist weltoffen und New York ist es auch. Beide Städte verbindet eine große transatlantische Tradition. De Blasio ist seit 4 Jahren Bürgermeister von New York und hat erdrutschartig die Wahlen gewonnen. Und ich glaube, das, was wir gleich hören werden, ist möglicherweise etwas über New York. Aber New York ist als Weltstadt natürlich auch ein Symbol oder ein kleiner Kern dessen, was uns auf der Welt global auch beschäftigt, wenn wir über Fragen der sozialen Gerechtigkeit, Ökologie, dem Umgang mit Einwanderern und Ähnlichem sprechen. De Blasio hat bei seiner Wahl gesagt, er möchte in New York keinen New Yorker zurücklassen, das heißt alle mitnehmen, das heißt seine soziale Verantwortung sieht er als sehr hoch an. Mir persönlich ist die Veranstaltung heute früh, wie überhaupt diese Tage, sehr, sehr wichtig. Sie war natürlich ein großes Risiko. Wir wussten überhaupt nicht, ob wir noch mobilisieren können. Wir wussten nicht, ob Sie, verehrtes Publikum, überhaupt eine Chance haben, hierher zu kommen. Und wir wussten auch schließlich nicht genau, ob Sie den Mut dazu haben würden. Den haben Sie offensichtlich und dazu gratuliere ich Ihnen da unten, dass Sie heute hier sind. Denn es ist doch sehr wichtig, dass wir gegen alle Widrigkeiten das soziale Leben, das zivile Leben in unserer Stadt weiterführen. Und ein Anlass ist eben der Besuch von Blasio. Klaus Brinkbäumer, der auch furchtlos ist, wäre gerne hier, aber er hat tatsächlich den Weg nicht geschafft. Er hat auch noch ein zusätzliches Problem. Wir haben ihm gestern gesagt, wir garantieren, dass das klappt. Das war etwas hochmütig. Wir garantieren, dass es klappt, dass er unmittelbar nach der Veranstaltung zum Flughafen kommt, um wohin zu fliegen, in die USA, nach Boston. Das konnten wir jetzt heute nicht garantieren, deswegen ist er nicht da. Und Sie müssen damit Vorlieb nehmen, dass ich im Anschluss einige Fragen an Blasio stelle, aber er hat gerade gesagt, dass er auch bereit ist, auf Ihre Fragen zu antworten. Okay, ich danke Ihnen und wünsche Ihnen einen interessanten Vormittag. Im Anschluss ich gehe auf eine der Demonstrationen, Sie vielleicht auch. Wir denken vielleicht, dass wir eine Stunde uns hier miteinander unterhalten und dann wünsche ich Ihnen einen interessanten oder engagierten Samstag in Hamburg. Dankeschön.
Thank you. Danke. Guten Morgen. Good morning, everybody, and it is an honor to be with you here. Thank you, Joachim, for kindly welcoming me, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership of this theater. Will you please join me in applauding Joachim for his wonderful work? It is wonderful to be at the Thalia Theater because it's quiet and peaceful, unlike the rest of Hamburg right now. And I actually feel like I'm looking forward to going back to New York City because it's calmer and more tranquil than Hamburg. But this theater is legendary for being a place of free expression and creativity and diversity and appreciation for all the cultures of the world. And it's very, very fitting to be here. A lot's going on in this city right now. but this place reminds us of what we really value. I know the people of Hamburg and the people of Germany value this sense of diversity and inclusion and openness and freedom and democracy expressed here on this stage. And we in New York City and in the United States value those things as well. And one thing I appreciate deeply about the theater when it really probes the human condition is it thinks about and expresses the lives of everyday people. And that's what we hope will happen at something like a G20 summit. We hope that the experiences of everyday people are in the front of the minds of the leaders, and sometimes we worry that won't be the case. But here, that's always the case. And so this theater is something so powerful, I know so beloved in this community, but it speaks to something larger. Now, I have to tell you, as a New Yorker, I'm very, very proud. You know, New Yorkers have very strong opinions. Maybe some of you who's been to New York City. If you've been to New York City, raise your hand. Excellent. Please come back. We want to see you again. We have wonderful foods for you to try, like the Frankfurter and the hamburger. You have to come and experience them. But you would know, so many of you have been there, that there's some very, very powerful parallels between New York City and Hamburg. And I'm very struck by it. Both cities with tremendous histories of connecting to the rest of the world. And maritime cities and mercantile cities where the sense of the need to be connected to the world was essential to identity and our very being and our very livelihood. And for New York, we feel this is part of what has made us strong, and we feel we're great. It's part of what's made us great, that we, from the very beginning of our modern existence, almost 400 years ago, we understood ourselves as connected to everyone else. And if you read the descriptions of early New York City, even at the very beginning, every kind of people walked the streets. It was understood there would be people of different faiths and backgrounds and different languages spoken. And it worked. It was by no means perfect. And we still grapple with the effort to create something better. But it worked. And from my understanding of the history of Hamburg, the same reality, cosmopolitan city, an open city, city that valued people. And I really appreciate everything I've seen written about this city, the phrase that I see over and over, the free and Hanseatic city, which I find lovely because it's an evocation of your history of not believing in monarchy or the rule by the one or the few, and your understanding of the connection to others around you. There's something powerful that you've continued here. So I think it's very fitting that I'm here to experience your city, and our cities have such a deep connection, but it's also fitting that you're hosting this summit. With all its challenges, you're hosting a summit that, again, we would hope would grapple productively with the biggest issues we face. We hope would be a place of cooperation and consideration for the challenges our planet faces. We would hope would be a place where democratic values were expressed and productive and constructive conversation would happen. And again, I don't think I'd be jumping too far ahead to say many of us assume that we probably won't get to see all that from this summit. But it's right that it's happening someplace that expresses those values. It's happening someplace that believes in the value of democratic discourse and the value of an open search for better solutions. Now, this city, I'm impressed by what I've seen in terms of Hamburg's efforts to address these thorny, difficult problems that plague us in the world today. I'm impressed that Hamburg sees itself as a city, as a leader in the fight against climate change, not waiting on just your national government, but seeing this as a local issue, something we all have to address ourselves. As Americans, we feel that very powerfully. because we've waited for our national government to act for years and years, and it hasn't sufficiently. And so we have to take matters into our own hand locally. So it's inspiring to see Hamburg do all it's done to address climate change. It's inspiring to see efforts to make education more available and more equal and more affordable for people who are struggling economically. This is something we work on every day in New York City as well. And we find solutions even when they don't come from above. We create them from below. We create them from the grassroots. It's inspiring to see this city deal with what's obviously a complex and challenging issue of immigration, particularly in light of the refugee crisis gripping the world. And yet, my sense is that Hamburg has found many ways to productively address the crisis and have an open dialogue with its people. These are things we try and do every day in New York City as well. And democracy, I don't need to tell anyone here, democracy by definition is messy. It's difficult. The theater exhibits the difficulty of the human condition, the way people grapple, the way they seek solutions, despite some of the pushes and pulls. But democracy done right, the openness brings out solutions, and it brings out the voice of the people, and it brings out the urgency, and it portrays and allows for a full understanding of the human consequences of inaction. Democracy propels action at its best. And I think this city is a good example of that. And I think it's noble that Hamburg chose to host the G20 despite the problems of the G20, despite the contradictions inherent in the cast of characters and some of the values that they bring to the table. And it is a noble choice to know there will be protest. Protest itself underlies so much of what allows us to change. Now, I want to emphasize, and our nation has a very, very rich history of protest that led to change, but I think history proves over and over peaceful protest leads to change. I think in our country there's no one we revere more than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was the great voice of peaceful protest, who borrowed so strongly from Gandhi, who understood that peaceful protest allowed the actual ideas and the issues and all their urgency to come through. And violent protest is not only inhumane, but obscures meaning. And so for everyone, it's been difficult to watch the last few days because it's not what we believe in, it's not what we aspire to. And I say in New York City, we've had, obviously, since the November election, tremendous strong feelings and oppositional feelings have been expressed in our city and all over the nation, and often take the form of large protests and spontaneous protests. But we recognize in New York City that not only do they have to be peaceful, we also appreciate the role our police play as the guardians of a free and open democracy. And I've had many times when I've said to audiences at protests, I want you to take a moment to appreciate the police officers who stand by to guard your right to protest. So even though we know it's been the actions of a very few, it has been sad and reprehensible and obviously unacceptable that there's been violence against police officers and violence against civilians and property as well. This doesn't allow us to move forward. The underlying issues that are being raised may be real, but the way they're being raised doesn't help us move forward. Being said, we, all of us who do believe in democracy and pluralism and the power of peaceful protests, the responsibility comes back to the rest of us to show that those mechanisms are the better way and to show that they can work and they can actually respond to people's lives. And this brings me again to the juxtaposition with the summit itself. I would love to believe that those leaders are gathering in their meeting rooms and thinking altruistically. I'd love to believe they're thinking about the everyday lives of the people they're supposed to represent, and I'd love to believe that they would feel a sense of urgency that they can't leave Hamburg without resolution of important issues. And we'll see in the coming hours, but again, I have my doubts. And then when people around the world watch the outcome, if they don't see those resolutions, if they don't see those acts of progress and constructive decision-making, there'll be a sense of letdown, of course. There'll be a sense of a missed opportunity. I don't bemoan that. I don't look at that and say, well, leaders shouldn't get together because sometimes it doesn't work. Leaders have to get together. They have to get together. They have to attempt dialogue. They have to attempt to find constructive outcomes. Sometimes they disappoint us. Some leaders don't have the same motivation the rest of us would have to actually want those changes. But they have to get together, because the only thing that's worse is if they're not talking and they're not in a dialogue. But another thing I think we learn over time is if we're just waiting on our leaders, we're making a mistake. If our conception of democracy is to elect people and then walk away, we don't understand the full democratic equation. It's our responsibility, all of us, to animate democracy, to make it the living, breathing thing it's supposed to be. And we are grappling with this right now in our country in a very profound way, because we had an election, and I don't have to tell any of you, an election with a result unlike anything we've seen. I'm not talking about the person, I'm talking about literally the process of the election and how the numbers came together and the difference between the Electoral College and the popular vote. It's unprecedented in our history, this particular situation. And one of the things that many people felt after the election in the United States was they felt a sense of confusion and an attempt to try and understand where to go in the context of our democracy. And it's not surprising, many people, I would argue a majority, I think I have facts to back this up, a majority of Americans felt deep concern after the election. And some felt let down, and some felt confused, and some felt depressed, but the message I tried to offer was, it was simply a moment of clarification, that the responsibility comes back to all of us, that we have to live out our values in all facets of our lives if we want to respond to something that we don't agree with. We have to live out our values by being involved in the democratic process. We have to live out our values through peaceful protest. We have to live out our values in how we treat people every day. We can never mistake what happens in a single election for what we truly believe in and what our values are. And I said this particularly to my fellow New Yorkers who had a particular sense of being let down for a variety of reasons. I said the values of New York City didn't change on November 8th. You know, decades and decades of developing who we were, what we believe in, why we were a city that was open and diverse and tolerant, why we believed in all faiths and the respect for all faiths. These things didn't happen overnight. They happened generation after generation, and by definition, a single election doesn't change that. So that we had to get back to the work of expressing our values and acting on our values. And I think this is the key in this moment. Yes, leaders will be elected, and yes, they'll have summit meetings, and yes, we wish for the best. But we take matters into our own hands ultimately, right here at the local level where life is lived. Most people don't think about big global affairs. They often don't know the names of their leaders. They think about what happens right here, don't they? Right here, where they live, their schools, their jobs. They care about their families, their neighborhoods. That's how people think. That's how they live. And if here in Hamburg, and if cities all around Germany and all around Europe, and if in New York City and cities and towns all over the United States, people are acting on their best values, they're listening to their better angels, that's actually how the world changes. We have seen it over and over again in our nation. And I'll say, I'm a very, very proud American, but I understand the contradictions of American history. I understand the mistakes we've made. I understand the times when we were far away from our stated ideals. But I've also seen the extraordinary corrective power of democracy and how, time and time again, people's voices rose up, started small, often started locally, and grew and grew and grew. We're fighting right now to save our Mother Earth. And we know in the United States, and it's true now with the current administration, and honestly it was true too often in the previous administration because of the difference between the White House and the Congress. The big changes couldn't happen so often. And so we knew we had to do it. We had to do it. And you see in cities like New York, and you see in states like California, and you see in many other states and cities, a devotion to addressing climate change ourselves, to setting the highest goals for reducing our emissions, for helping our people to change our approach so that we can be the authors of the bigger changes needed in the world. And you know, if enough cities do it, if enough states do it, if enough people do it, it changes. Doesn't always require a vote of a parliament or a Congress or an action of a president or a prime minister if the change is happening at the grassroots. We see this on the issue that I felt was tearing my city and my country apart when I ran for mayor, the question of income inequality. This extraordinary, sharp stratification that's happening more all the time. In America, we use the phrase the 1%. Those who have concentrated wealth and power in a way we've almost never seen before in our history, but is undermining the very idea of our democracy and the very idea of an inclusive society and an economically open society. We know that that threatens everything. Just like climate change threatens our very ability to live on this earth, growing income inequality threatens the very nature of our democracy and the cohesion of our society. But rather than saying, why hasn't our Congress acted, because we know it won't, we say we'll do it ourselves. We will find ways to raise the conditions of working people. We'll find a way to create a more equal and inclusive economy. We'll do it with the tools we have. And it's not by any means giving permission to our national government not to act. It is showing by example that there could be something different and better, and that something will ultimately be demanded by more and more people. This is the task of our times. And I'll conclude by saying, I want to just sort of make sure you get a feeling of what I think for the people of my city and for so many Americans is our way forward. Because again, it is, I'm not sure what has been portrayed to you. I know what's been portrayed in the American media about our country since our election. And I can say, I think even the portrayals provided by our own commentators and observers miss some of the underlying reality. America is a country in the midst of profound change. America is sorting out its identity right now. But if you look closely, you see a country moving increasingly towards its best ideals. There's a beautiful phrase from our foundational documents and something a lot of us cling to. We talk about a more perfect union, those exact words, a more perfect union. And in a funny way, in a powerful way, imagine that the nation that we are so proud of and we feel such a strong identity as part of says in its foundational documents, we're not done yet, that we have to keep searching. We will search for our truest identity. We'll search for the way to apply our truest ideals. We are in the process of development, right? Happens on the stage every time you see a wonderful work of theater and you see the development of the characters and their emotions and their understanding and their perceptions, and they grow before your very eyes, and you admire the characters who can grow, who can understand or who can realize their past mistakes, overcome the things they thought were their barriers that were insurmountable. Well, that's my country. That's certainly my city. We're in the process of change. If you look closely, most Americans want a more equal society. They want a more inclusive society. Most Americans respect people of all faiths and don't want to see discrimination based on religion. Most Americans understand that we all were immigrants once. As we say in the United States, some came willingly and some came against their will, but we were all immigrants. And our country understands that when wealth and power are in the hands of a few, it does not fit our American values. All of these realizations are increasingly true, increasingly deeply felt, and they will result in change in our country. So for those who look at the election with confusion or with fear, I would remind you it's one point along the road of the democratic process, and that we as Americans have a lot more work to do. But I'll finish by saying, when you look city by city, town by town, state by state, there's a lot that I find very moving about what's happening now in America. Not that many years ago in our country, there were forms of intolerance that were accepted broadly. I'm not saying by the few or by the fringe, that were accepted broadly. And there were kinds of unfairness that were institutionalized and seemed to be impossible to overcome. And again, step by step, they've been chipped away at and changed and modified. You know, a decade or more ago in the United States of America, it was inconceivable to think about marriage equality being the law of the country. And I know this country just went through its journey as well. That happened because people spoke up, city by city, town by town, changed the national consciousness well before the lawmakers acted. That's our mission again. And I have tremendous confidence that that is where my city and my country is going, to a more fair and inclusive place. And I know it'll take a lot of work, and I know it won't be a linear path. But I'll say that just like Hamburg grapples every day honestly with these challenges, it's our nature, on the ground, at the grassroots, feeling the lives of our people, that we have to respond. People demand it. And in the end, the voices of the people are actually the thing that matter, that let the leaders meet in their grand halls and meeting rooms. But the voices of the people actually rule the day when all is said and done. Thank you. Thank you. Danke.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this, from my impression, very optimistic speech. That's really interesting. And I would ask a few questions. The first one is, you started your speech about the cosmopolitan spirit of New York and the cosmopolitan spirit of Hamburg. And where do you take your optimism that this spirit has really a chance, especially in America after the last elections, which is the contrary, the new protectionism?
I think we have to separate, when you talk about cosmopolitan spirit, a couple of pieces within it. I think there's the question of respect for different people, different backgrounds, different religions, etc. And then there's the question of the connection to the rest of the world, economically, socially, politically. On the first point, we've seen the evolution of our country so consistently. And I'll say this about New York City as well. You know, I believe fundamentally, as I said, that our origins were cosmopolitan and open, and we maintained that reality throughout. That doesn't mean we didn't have huge conflicts along the way. Even just in the last few decades, New York City, you know, one of the most diverse cities on the earth, has grappled with our own questions of identity and inclusion. There have been conflicts between communities. There's been tensions between police and community. We have not finished the mission of addressing those issues, but we can see with our own eyes how much progress has been made, and I think you can see so much of that around our country as well. I think even though there have been painful realities dredged up by this election and by some of the horrible rhetoric that was a part of this election, you've also seen much greater numbers of people associating with renouncing division and hatred, and powerful, powerful acts of inclusion for people of all faiths. So I think if the question is cosmopolitan and inclusive in terms of a diverse, multicultural, multi-faith society, I think there's just immense evidence that that's the way America is evolving, and the election was not representative in so many ways. If you're talking about the connection to the world, I think America's very proud. This is my personal editorial comment. I think Americans are very proud of the good we've done in the world, and a lot of us understand some of the missteps and unfortunate and negative things that we've done at different points in our history on the global stage. But if the issue comes to something like trade, understand it for what it is. It is the anger and frustration that so many Americans feel over the issue of trade is not about the value of connecting to the rest of the world. It is about feeling that the trade deals were for corporations and for the 1% and made the rich richer and took away economic opportunity, that they were not actually based on the needs of the people. It's not that trade can't be done properly or fairly. It's that the approach to trade that has dominated in recent decades was of and by and for the corporate class, not the working class. That's where the anger and frustration comes from. There are other models that are productive and positive, but this whole discussion is forcing us to now redefine what the positive model is.
And in the city itself, how to live together. You know, there are so different concepts, and we're discussing it in Germany as well. The one concept is, let's say, to have a ghetto like Chinatown, or to mix the populations as possible. Yeah. In Indonesia, for example, they mix it. They have a strategy to say, okay, 20% of this population and this and this and this. And another concept would be, okay, Chinatown as an example. In Germany, some people say, okay, let's make a new Damascus, and a new city with Syrian, and others say, no, that's not the way. We have to work with integration. What is your opinion? Or
It's a wonderful question. And we address this in New York City all the time. So there are two opposing theories that have come out sort of in the in the discussion in New York City over recent decades, and certainly the American consciousness. So the classic American theory was the quote-unquote melting pot, which I always found distressing. First of all, we do not want to melt as human beings, very, very uncomfortable physically, and don't want to be put in a pot. The notion of melting pot, although I think some of its origins were noble, unfortunately conformed to wanting to take away difference, wanting to somehow get people to renounce identity and that which they valued, and that they could not be full members of society unless they renounced what was part of their heritage. The opposing theory is the mosaic. Mayor I worked for in New York City, Mayor Dinkins, when I was young, he used the phrase the gorgeous mosaic, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, that the pieces are distinct and create a whole, not separated, not unable to reach and touch each other, but that there is a fundamental respect for people's origins and cultures. I'm on my Italian side, I am the second generation born in the United States. And I'm very, very proud of my Italian heritage, and it gives me so much, and it gives me perspective that I care deeply about. It doesn't make me any less American, doesn't make me any less proud to be an American. And I think if you asked Americans of different backgrounds, that would be the dominant view. Particularly if their families have come to this country in the last few generations, that they're proud of their heritage and simultaneously devoted to America. There's no contradiction. So we in New York, we constantly are looking for ways to diversify and bring people together. There are legal constrictions in America. You can't always mandate it. But the natural reality that's happened in a place like New York City of different ethnic communities, different nationalities often living together. That's been organic, but it has not stopped us from finding a relative harmony. I always use the example of a New York City subway car. I'm going to ask the audience again, how many have been on a New York City subway train? Very good, excellent representation. So I say that if you want the perfect ideal of the world of the future, think of a New York City subway car, particularly during rush hour, and a lot of different people crammed in closely. Not that we want a crowded world, but I think this is an honest evocation in some ways of the reality of the world. People of all backgrounds. Literally have the Muslim and Jewish person next to each other. You have the immigrant and the person whose family has been in America for many, many generations. You have the rich and the poor. People of all faiths, people of all backgrounds, crammed in closely together. And I like it as a metaphor because it's not perfect. You know, it's not necessarily the way you'd want to live life to be the sardine in the sardine can. But what you notice is there is a working harmony. Everyone understands to sort of live and let live, make room for each other, move aside when someone's getting on or off. And they don't have to agree on everything. They don't have to like everything even about each other. But like we say, we're all in the same boat, we're all in the same subway car, and we make it work. That's my idea of the kind of society that works.
But that's very nice, but, but what is necessary to succeed? Because it's really depressing that the time of Obama was not long enough to change it concerning the black minority really in the society.
You know, obviously a huge question. I'll only attempt to speak to part of it. We, again, have to change the reality of the relationship between races and peoples in our country. We have to change that from the ground up. There are things the national government can do, but again, I like to be very clear-eyed about, I have tremendous respect for President Obama, but remember, except for 2 years, President Obama did not ever have a majority in the Congress, and most of what he wanted to do was limited after those first 2 years by that reality, that political reality. And, you know, the power of the White House as a platform to speak from and to shape ideas, that's certainly meaningful. But in the end, if the national government is either paralyzed or unwilling to act, the change has to happen locally. What's happening in America right now, in my opinion, it's certainly true in New York City, is that generational change is profoundly improving the dynamic of race relations. Again, if you look at news coverage, you're going to see the most horrible incidents, and those are real. You're going to see injustices. You're going to see things that are not being addressed that need to be addressed. You're certainly going to see in some states laws that are inhibiting people's rights, including the right to vote. There's some very, very troubling things happening. But if you think a little more sociologically, generational change is having a powerful impact on our nation. The generations emerging are much less burdened by the biases and prejudices of the past. They're much more open to a multicultural society. Let's be clear, they're expressing it in their own lives. You see, I happen to be in an interracial relationship. My wife is African American. This is becoming more and more common, and it's the most elemental form of change. People aren't doing it for reasons of politics or symbolism. They happen to fall in love with someone of another race. And it's more and more understood and accepted in our nation. So change is happening from the grassroots. It's happening in, as I mentioned earlier, the relationship between police and community, which has been very difficult over generations, and yet you see very powerful change starting to happen. We're an example of it. In New York City, even just a few years ago, and certainly a few decades ago, there was tremendous tension between police and communities of color. Today, you see a police force that, by the way, has many more representatives of communities of color on it, that under my administration has been trained in how to work more closely with communities, how to have a deeper dialogue, how to de-escalate tensions and conflicts at the local level. And very, very successfully, our police officers are doing an outstanding job of applying a new philosophy that's changing things. And even one thing I'm very, very proud of that is sort of a great example of the power of change at the local level. We now in New York City are implementing what is called implicit bias training for our police force. And it's literally, and this is something particularly necessary in America with all the diversity that's inherent in America, it is training our public servants to understand that every single one of us grows up with a bias, cultural, familial, whatever it may be. And we need to weed those out. When we work with everyone else, we have to see them for their humanity and see the common humanity in all of us. That's how we're training our police officers now. That would have been impossible. Just a few years ago, that would have been impossible to achieve. This is one city, but I would tell you, if you look around cities and towns all over America, these changes are happening. Not because we're perfect, not because I'm not trying to describe some kind of nirvana happening on the ground in America while our electoral process is obviously creating some strange results. I am saying that the truer change is this sort of the bigger generational change is much more important and is not getting the attention it deserves.
A final question. You spoke about the climatic issues, and if you would be the mayor of New York for the next 10 years, what changes in New York in these 10 years? Are there cars in the city or not? Do you forbid it? How do you deal it?
I like the way you think. I don't think we're going to get quite that far. But it's good to be a dreamer. I think a lot will change, and I think there's receptivity to change. So one of the things that we've increasingly realized is, again, we not only need to be bold in addressing climate change, but now we have to overcompensate for the actions recently of our national government. And that I want to emphasize, I believe I have a lot of opinion research to back this up. The action our president took in stepping away from the Paris Accord does not represent the majority view of the American people. It just doesn't. American people get it. You know, I always use the example of New York City. 10 years ago, if you had asked New Yorkers about climate change, I think you would have found a lot of people understood the problem and then a lot of other folks who were skeptical or who didn't feel it was pertinent as an issue to their lives. Then Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. It was the worst natural disaster we've ever experienced. Dozens of people killed, billions of dollars of damage, thousands of families dislocated. And climate change became real and became personal. Now we're, New York City, one of the great coastal cities of the world. It's not abstract for us anymore. And I think that has led to a stronger social consensus that we have to act. But originally we thought we had to act in concert with our national government. Now we have to act aside from our national government, and we have to go farther. And I'm very, very inspired, obviously, especially by the example of California, which has distinctly and boldly said that as a state, it will lead the way in reducing emissions and creating its own reality. That, I think, is going to be the paradigm in many parts of the United States. And I think that's going to be increasingly the demand, again, particularly from the generations emerging. So what does it look like? Every building, literally every building will have to be retrofitted. We will have to move increasingly to electric cars, or potentially, I know Hamburg has been leading the way in the research around hydrogen vehicles. That's another strong possibility, but emission-free vehicles will increasingly be the norm. We also have to use our power, and I spoke to your mayor about this, the power we have as a city, and you could say this of any city, any town, any state. Each of us has a power to move the economy in our own way by what we do with our economic power. We're going to use our economic power to foster renewable energy, which has not developed in the United States to the extent it has in Germany, but is increasingly, rapidly catching up. We're going to use our economic power as a city government, to move more and more to solar and wind and hydropower. A stunning thing about the United States, so you will be able to relate to this. I always say that the United States has its own character politically, but New York City has developed in many ways with the mindset of a social democratic worldview that is so common in Europe. And so the government of New York City is very large, very strong. We have an annual budget of $85 billion, which for a city of 8.5 million people is an extraordinarily large budget. That comes with the power to shape change. So we will use every tool we have to move to renewable energy. And I think the last thing I'd say on this is that, as each action is taken, the assumptions change. And this is why I have hope. I am more distressed about climate change than I could possibly express. I read some of the scientific analysis, and it's very, very painful. And one could feel hopeless. And then I remind myself that we have no choice but to believe the science but not be paralyzed by it. So the question is, how rapidly can we change? How deeply can we change? And then pray that Mother Earth can repair herself as a result. One thing I do know is that every time you show that renewable energy can be used on a larger and larger scale, every time you show the ways that we can stop wasting energy and conserve, that we can change our own habits, more and more people using mass transit, more and more people using bicycles, more and more people walking, whatever it may be, the assumptions change, the possibilities change, and people acclimate, and they feel good about it. They feel good about being a part of the change. And that also makes me hopeful. In the end, again, I wish I believed that national governments would save the day. I have no such illusion. We should work for that. We should aspire to that. I believe local governments are actually the ones that will save the day, and I believe the people will demand it of us, and the people will show they're ready for it. And when they're ready for it, change happens. Thank you.
Ja. Vielen Dank, sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, dass Sie heute Vormittag hier waren. Vielen Dank, Beide Blasio, dass Sie hier waren. Ich glaube, wenn die Mischung von Pragmatismus und optimistischem Geist, wie sie hier gerade zu spüren war, den G20 beherrschen würde, dann wäre für die Welt viel gewonnen. Thanks that you have been here.
Thank you very much.